How pervasive is gun violence in the United States? And what impact, if any, should that have on our gun rights? In other videos, I've argued that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, and we have this right regardless of any impact that it might have on crime. But what impact does it have on crime? This is still a fair question, and it's an important question to answer because this is a topic where so many people get off on the wrong track when it comes to gun rights. Many Americans have a distorted view of gun violence in this country, and this leads to an outsized fear of guns. And this fear is encouraged by those who have agendas. And these agendas are manifested in the way the media covers school shootings and gun violence in general. This in turn leads to an impulse to do something. And I'm always troubled by this impulse to do something because what this typically means is more gun control. That's a problem because, as I've argued, our gun rights are fundamental rights that should not be undermined. But so much of this stems from an inaccurate picture of gun violence. And that's why it's so important to paint an accurate picture. And that's what I hope to do in this presentation. It's so important for people to see how gun violence actually plays out in this country. In order to do that, we should start very generically. We should remember that the United States is a country of 330 million people. Each year, about 2.5 to 3.5 million of those Americans die from all different causes. Of that 2.5 to 3.5 million, about 50,000 are gun-related deaths. I'm getting my data from an article by a John Gramlich from Pew Research. This article compiled data from the CDC and the FBI. According to him, the exact number of gun deaths in 2021 was 48,830. Now, this is up significantly from the pre-COVID-19 pandemic. According to the article, gun suicides are up about 10% in that time, and gun homicides are up about 45%. And this is an important distinction right there. Of those 48,000 gun deaths, more than 50% are suicides. So, according to the article, that leaves about 20,000 gun murders. Okay, well, where are those gun murders happening? And this is another extremely important point to make. Gun violence in the United States is highly concentrated. It's concentrated geographically, and it's concentrated demographically. There's a good author named John Lott Jr. He does a lot of good gun crime analysis. He runs an institution known as the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's got a good article from January 17th of 2023 entitled, "Murders in the U.S. are very concentrated, and they're becoming even more so." According to Mr. Lott, 2% of U.S. counties were responsible for 56% of the gun murders in 2020. On the other hand, 52% of U.S. counties had no murders. So that means half the country doesn't even have this problem. Now, he breaks this down a bit further. He says that the worst 1% had 42% of the murders, and the worst 5% had 73% of the murders. The concentration is not just within counties. It's also within particular zip codes in those counties. He uses Los Angeles County as an example, and in that case, 10% of the worst zip codes accounted for 41% of the murders. The worst 30% of zip codes accounted for 82% of the murders. On the other hand, the best 40% of zip codes only accounted for 1%. Another good city to use as an example is the city of Chicago, and There's a really good article from October 24th, 2022. This was in Crain's Chicago Business. This was by a Stephen Hendershot. According to this article, 5 of Chicago's most violent police districts accounted for 42% of Chicago's total homicides in 2021. This is out of 25 police districts. I want to pause here for a minute and talk about Chicago. A lot of us who share my views on guns, we tend to complain about Chicago. We don't like the way it's run. We don't care for the politicians running it. We complain about the crime spilling over into the suburbs. But it's important for those of us who think that way to also keep perspective. Because as much as Chicago has problems, the truth of the matter is, most of the city, most of the time, is peaceful. You're not going to run into constant gun violence if you travel to Chicago. It's obviously a few troubled neighborhoods at certain times of the day. They give the example in the article of the Austin neighborhood and of the Garfield Park neighborhood. They compare that to some of the most violent cities in the world, like Tijuana, Mexico. The funny thing is, though, I'm familiar with Garfield Park and with the Austin neighborhood, and there's an industrial corridor that goes right through those neighborhoods down Lake Street. And if you go there in the middle of the day, you'll see people carrying boxes into factories and walking around. It's not constant gun violence. It's not a shooting gallery. So we got to keep perspective here. And again, this further shows that gun violence is highly concentrated. It's a few counties, a few cities within a few counties, a few neighborhoods within a few cities, and arguably a few sections of a few neighborhoods. Gun violence is also concentrated demographically. When we talk about age group, the most at-risk age group are those 15 to 35. That's where you'll find a lot of the perpetrators and a lot of the victims. And you'll see this in all the data from the CDC, the FBI, etc. The perpetrators are also often males. The victims are also often males. You don't see a lot of women involved in gun violence. Now, I should pause here. I'm not a fan of the casual male bashing that we have these days. I certainly don't buy into this toxic masculinity nonsense. We should remember that when we talk about men and gun violence, this is a very, very small group of men. And it requires more explanation as to why it's men more often than women that engage in this violence. Nonetheless, the statistics are what they are. It is often men, more often men than women. The violence is also concentrated racially and ethnically. A lot of this violence is found in Black and, to some degree, Latino communities. Now, just as I paused for the data about men, we should also pause about this data. We certainly should not draw any discriminatory inferences from this data. This is not an excuse for stigmatizing or profiling or anything like that. Nonetheless, it is often something that you'll find in the Black and Latino community more so than in the white community. There is a June 30th, 2022 fact sheet from the Center for American Progress. This is a more left-wing publication. They support gun control. I certainly don't, but they offer some good data. According to them, in 2020, 12,179 Black Americans were killed with guns, compared to 7,286 white Americans. Most of those deaths were black-on-black violence, and with the whites, it was white-on-white violence. So we see that this type of violence is more often intra-racial as opposed to interracial. Another good article from Johns Hopkins, July 27th, 2023, analyzing CDC data. According to that article, Black Americans were 20 times as likely to be killed with guns, and Latinos were 4 times as likely as whites to be killed with guns. Another article, Johns Hopkins, June 6, 2023, young black males age 15 to 34 accounted for 36% of all gun homicides in 2021, but they represent only 2% of the total U.S. population. Now again, got to keep perspective. That's a small group of people. Most young black men never hurt anybody, and we shouldn't forget that. But to the extent that you have this problem, you do have it among this demographic. In 2021, guns were responsible for 51% of all deaths of black teens aged 15 to 19. Very tragic. There's some other data that people should be aware of. The John Lott article that I mentioned earlier, according to that article, rural households are more likely to have a gun. They're 79% more likely to have a gun. Suburban households are about 37.9% more likely to have a gun than urban households. So this is another interesting piece of this picture. You've got more guns in rural America, but less gun violence. You have less guns in urban settings, but much more gun violence. In talking about the rural versus urban, I should point out that gun control advocates will often try to be deceptive with these statistics. They'll say, for instance, that in many red states with lax gun regulation that you'll actually have a higher per capita gun death rate. Well, what they don't tell you is that that's driven by suicides. We talked about earlier how suicides account for more than 50% of the gun deaths in this country. A good example of this is the state of Wyoming. They have a high per capita gun death rate that's driven mostly by suicides. Suicide is obviously not a gun problem. That's a despair problem. That's a mental health problem, maybe even an access to health care problem. Certainly not a gun problem. Of course, I would argue that none of this is really a gun problem. Gun control advocates will also point out that in some red states, again with lax gun regulations, that you'll have a high homicide rate. Mississippi's a good example of this. Of course, again, what they don't tell you is that those numbers are driven by blue communities within red states. And in the case of Mississippi, you have a city like Jackson that has a very high gun homicide rate, comparable to what you'll see in places like Chicago and Philadelphia and LA and Gary, Indiana, etc. So don't be deceived by those statistics. When we pull all this data together, a much clearer picture emerges. And what that picture shows is that gun violence is just not a problem in most of this country. That, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about those who do struggle with this problem, people who are stuck in bad neighborhoods. But the reality is that you have millions upon millions of Americans that own guns. Some of them own very powerful guns. Some of them have little arsenals in their homes. And yet those guns never harm anybody. What you have in a lot of our inner cities is family breakdown, poor education, poor leadership. Those problems require our attention, but those problems are not going to be solved by taking away guns from millions of Americans who exercise their Second Amendment rights responsibly. Gun control is not the answer. And a government that doesn't trust its people with the right to bear arms is a government that doesn't deserve its people's trust.